Hi, my name is Meghan Quigley. I am a junior elementary teacher education major with a concentration in English as a second language. This summer, I evaluated the relationship between children's dialect use and their oral language and writing. I'd like to start this presentation off with a quote. Linguists have a saying, as we see a people, so we see their language. As we see a language, so we see its people. As stated by Hobbes, our attitudes about language and culture and people flow through each other without us realizing the equivalency. How you communicate plays part to how you are perceived, and unfortunately, with linguistic diversity comes linguistic discrimination. In order to evaluate how dialect relates to literacy achievement, first we have to define dialect. So, what is dialect? To put it simply, dialect is just a variety of a language spoken by a particular group of people. Similar to language, each dialect is complex and has rules governing grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. This means that dialectical variations can be phonological, semantic, morphological, and syntactic. Every individual speaks a dialect, whether they are conscious of it or not. Additionally, all dialects are linguistically equal. This means that no dialect is correct or superior, and conversely, no other dialect is slang. Some dialects are just more commonly accepted than others. The most commonly accepted dialect in the United States is referred to as Mainstream American English, or NMAE. There is a form of dialect known as cultural dialect. These dialects are not constrained by geographical borders, but are defined by the people who speak them. Some examples of cultural dialect include Chicano English and African American Vernacular English, or AAVE, which was the main focus of my project this summer. These dialects, which stray from mainstream American English, are referred to as non-mainstream American English, or NMAE. This area of research is relevant because non-mainstream speakers are suffering in schools. Unfortunately, according to NIEDO, many of the educators working with students are white, middle-class, monolingual, English-speaking women and men who have had little direct experience with cultural, ethnic, linguistic, or other kinds of diversity. Williams found that students who sounded more non-standard or non-white were rated as being less promising or effective students by teachers. And in fact, Black students are 40% more likely to be diagnosed with special needs or a language disorder. We can see the damaging effects of this treatment in the Palo Alto and Ravenswood School District study of 1990. Palo Alto and Ravenswood are two neighboring schools in California. Palo Alto is primarily composed of white students, and their students scored in the 94th percentile on the California Assessment Program test. Ravenswood is a school whose population is largely Black and Latinx. Their students scored in the 16th percentile on the same test. As time went on, the achievement gap between these two schools just continued to widen. Although there are other factors that affect achievement, such as wealth and school resources, some researchers say dialect also plays a part in these discrepancies. Clearly, our approach to teaching non-mainstream speakers is not as effective as it needs to be. This notion led me to this project, which I researched throughout the past 2 summers. And that brings me to my research questions. My first question was, what kinds of non-mainstream American English features do students use in oral and written language? Secondly, what is the relationship between dialect use and literacy achievement? I wanted to see if students who had higher frequency dialect use, such as African American Vernacular English, scored differently than peers with lower frequency dialect use. In prior analyses, researchers have analyzed the relationship between dialect use and literacy achievement for students in late elementary and middle school. One of the unique aspects of this project includes a focus on first grade students and their writing performance in their formative years of their literacy programs. To evaluate this question, I examined data collected by Professors David Coker and Kristen Ritchey during the 2017 to 2018 academic year in a local district. As you can see, the sample contains 134 first graders, nearly evenly split in terms of gender, with an ethnically diverse sample. Additionally, 18.3% currently receive English language support. To examine which non-mainstream features students use in oral language, we looked at students' performance on formulated sentences, which was a subtest from the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals. This test gave students a picture and a word or a set of words. They then had to generate a sentence orally using the words to describe the picture. This test was scored across a rubric for quality. We also used a written measure called picture story. This had students write a story about a set of pictures, which gave us insight on what non-mainstream features they use in written language as opposed to oral language. We evaluate length by counting words. Finally, we looked at a test called word classes. This is also a subtest from the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals. It is a receptive vocabulary assessment where students are given 3 words and choose the 2 that are related. This test is scored by how many sets of words students correctly pair. The first step of my analysis included developing a coding system to identify features of non-mainstream dialects. We utilized a coding system from prior research and altered it to be sensitive to additional dialectical features we found present in data. Additionally, our coding system was specific to morphosyntactic dialect features and not phonological features. I've included just a few examples of non-mainstream features that we coded for. One prominent feature we came across was subject-verb agreement. An example of this would be they was eating cookies compared to they were eating cookies. The next example we found used frequently was zero modal auxiliary. An example of this would be I only been there a few times compared to I have only been there a few times. Finally, the last example I'll include is zero preposition. An example of this is they got out the car compared to they got out of the car. These features are morphosyntactic, which means they dictated word endings such as plural markers and past tense. And again, those are just a few examples of features that we coded for. Next, Mr. Coker helped me analyze our results. Before we move on to what we found, I should explain our dialect density measure. Dialect density represents the proportion of dialect features per oral sentence or written T unit. We drew on previous work in the area to calculate this variable. What we found is that the dialect density across the whole sample was 6%. This means that in 6% of all data, there is at least one instance of dialect. This is similar across ethnic groups, as Black students had around 6% dialect density, white students had 5.5%, and Hispanic students had 8%. For other groups, such as students who identified as Asian or multi-ethnic, our samples were too small to have meaningful results. Additionally, the standard deviation exceeded the mean, showing high variability. For Black students, the standard deviation was 6.5%. For white students, the variation was 8%, and Hispanic students, the variation was 13%. We also looked at the differences in dialect density for students who currently receive or have received English language supports compared to students who haven't received services. We found that students who have received services have higher dialect density compared to those who did not. We also examined the correlations among these variables using non-parametric tests. We used non-parametric tests because of the distribution of our variables did not meet the assumptions of parametric tests. There are a few things I would like to draw your attention to. The first thing I'd like to address is that dialect density and vocabulary are negatively related. This means that the higher dialect density is related to lower vocabulary achievement. This finding is what we would expect based on current research in the area. Additionally, it is important to note that research considers vocabulary an important predictor of future academic success. Also consistent with existing research is the negative correlation between dialect density and the quality of oral sentences. Higher dialect density is related to lower scores on the formulated sentence task, which was our oral measure. The last correlation I would like to draw your attention to is perhaps the most interesting. That is that word count and dialect density are positively related. This means that the higher dialect density is related to writing more. So this is the opposite of what we expected. We had anticipated that students with higher dialect density would write less, not more. This is an interesting finding that we plan to investigate more in the future. It is important to note, however, that this is just a measure of written productivity, aka length. While for young students, length and writing quality are strongly related, we're still going to need to score these samples for quality to see if higher dialect use is associated with higher quality as well. And finally, I would just like to thank you all so much for listening, and a special thanks goes out to David Coker and Kristen Ritchey for making this project possible and for all of their support. I believe we have a few minutes for questions, but if I don't get to it, my email is at the bottom of this slide, so feel free to reach out to me. And here are my references. Thank you so much.